The first thing that we did, which definitely made the biggest impact, was MMC was actually the catalyst, because that's where I met my co-founder. He came to MMC for investment, and I was sort of sitting there evaluating pitch and thinking, this investment probably isn't right for them, and I'm not sure if they're the right investor for him. 12 to 18 months to get the first 25 or 30,000 users, but we then had this incredible period of growth, and we grew that free registered user base from about 25,000 to 1.25 million in the next 18 months. And we actually at one point had the former CEO of Bloomberg on our board. It wasn't obvious. People had different ideas about how we should ultimately execute the business. Freemium isn't free. Founders and entrepreneurs come in like loads of different shapes and sizes. They're not all Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg.
Thank goodness. Welcome to another weekly episode of Strategy and Tragedy, the podcast that spotlights the highs and the lows of business. I'm really excited to interview my next guest, Justin Fitzpatrick, who's the co-founder of DueDil, which became FullCircl, and now Outpost Advisors. Justin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Steph. It's great to be here.
So I'm going to kick things off with a bit of a weird question.
I love weird questions. Go for it.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'll take that as permission to keep going with weird questions.
Good.
And right off the bat, what did the political economy of Japan have to do with where you are now?
I could see you've really done your research. Look, in a way, nothing. I don't really have much to do with the political economy of Japan other than, maintaining a keen interest in it. But in other ways, I think it was a culmination of, an interest that I had from a very young age, which really opened my mind and some horizons for me. So I grew up in a mill town, not too far north of Boston, and my parents owned a bagel bakery, actually. So, entrepreneurs, but quite kind of blue collar, hard scrabble sort of existence. And I got, I guess, turned on to Japan when I was probably in, 12 or 13. And it wasn't for the traditional reasons. You talk to a lot of Westerners about why they like Japan, and they're into karate or anime or whatever. And I was just really fascinated by the country and the culture and the history of it. And, my kind of 12-year-old brain at the time, it was like the most exotic place that I could sort of think of. And so that's what sort of, propelled me down that path and, got me interested in it. And, many, many years later, I ended up doing a master's degree at Oxford in it. So
yeah, amazing. Well, that was kind of the answer I was expecting. It was a bit of an oddball to see that on your CV. Like, what? Wow, I don't think I've ever come across anyone who studied not even just like, Japan, like culture, but specifically the political economy. So I thought that was fascinating. Yeah. Sticking with this weird one for just a second, I'm just curious, as much as it largely kind of had nothing to do with the world that you're in at the moment, are there any like tiny kernels, as random as they may seem from the outside, are there any sort of connections? Is there anything that taught you, studying something that was kind of exotic and really off the wall, that you've connected to what you're doing now?
I think the thing that it taught me about myself was not being afraid to be interested in things that other people aren't interested in. Like there aren't that many people where I go to a party and they're like, oh, me too. Like I love the political economy. And actually like just having that confidence to be like, no, this is like part of my jam. Like, I think that can lead you into some really interesting places. And I've tried to embrace that over the years. And it's not always easy, right? Because there is this pressure to be involved in like the latest cool thing or whatever the next wave is that's coming. And I think I've increasingly embraced the fact that, I like kind of nerdy, boring, geeky, unsexy things. So I guess that would be the first thing. But the reason I was specifically interested in studying Japan is because the things that Japan has gone through over the last, 10 or 20 years at a, political and socioeconomic level are things that, we in the West are facing and will continue to face. There's obviously some big differences in terms of the demography of the country and, there are some high level similarities that I think, we now see ourselves confronting, the sort of skew towards an older population, a population which is maybe less able to rely on high levels of integration to kind of keep it going. So I sort of always thought like Japan is almost like a preview of coming attractions for the West.
It wasn't my plan to stick with this weird off the wall question, but it did just occur to me that I think you can extrapolate connections from seemingly from the outside, from the weirdest places.
Yeah.
So I love your answer to that. It's so interesting. Yeah. So moving along in the timeline a little bit. So you're famous for starting DueDil, which I have to say, my very first job, my first proper job, which was in a tiny boutique agency, we used DueDil.
Oh, did you? Okay.
So I was like, oh my God, the Found. We actually used you. We used you to kind of verify accounts and familiar with the product.
Yeah.
But before you started it, you worked on the investment side, didn't you? You worked for MMC.
Briefly, yeah, that's right.
How did that inform your decision to go off and start DueDil, coming from an investment background?
Yeah, so I mean, MMC was actually the catalyst because that's where I met my co-founder. So he had started the business already, and he came to MMC for investment. And I was sort of sitting there evaluating, the pitch and the pitch deck, and asking all the questions that you ask of entrepreneurs. And I was sort of sitting there thinking, this investment probably isn't right for them. And I'm not sure they're the right investor for him. But, we both kind of came away going, actually, you know what? I think, that guy, maybe there's something there and we should follow this up. So, but that was actually a really kind of brief interlude, because before that I had worked for a US-based entrepreneur. And that was a really interesting period. Like a lot of kind of first jobbers, I was like, I'll do this for a year or two and then, figure out what I really want to do and go off and do that. And I ended up staying at that business for 5 years. And over that period, it grew kind of 10x and, got to 250 million of revenue.
Wow.
Quite quickly. So it was a real, rocket ship of a journey. And
Which business was that one? Sorry?
So it was a company called Gerson Lerman Group and GLG. Mm-hmm. And, I joined as sort of employee number 100 and left as, there were 11 or 1,200 people in the business.
Wow.
And I thought, well, this entrepreneur thing is easy, right? And so I kind of had this flirtation with investment, just to see if I wanted to go on to the investment side. And had a great experience at MMC, wonderful people. I'm still in touch with many of them today. But, the conclusion for me was actually I'm a builder at heart, and I really wanted to be building something. And so kind of met my co-founder through that.
So what was it that attracted you to the opportunity with DueDil, to your co-founder? And then conversely, what were the points that made it not a right fit for MMC?
Yeah, it was an interesting one. I mean, look, I think MMC's investment profile has probably changed quite considerably in the 10 or 12 years since I was there. But my co-founder and I had quite different personalities, but I think the thing that made it work, we were both American, so there was a little bit of, common culture there that, we could bond over. We knew some of the same people. But I think we very quickly kind of coalesced around this idea of, making private company information more transparent and accessible. Mm. And so, we always shared, I think, a really strong view of what the kind of vision for the business should be. Where we kind of ultimately disagreed was how you get there. And that led to lots of ups and downs over the period of DueDil, but, ultimately resulted in, FullCircl, which is, still a thriving, profitable business today. So,
amazing. All right, we'll definitely get to that because I want to hear kind of how that all developed. But I'm just curious it sounds like you were attracted to this opportunity because you completely believed in the mission, the purpose, and definitely connected with the co-founder. I guess working for an investment firm at the time, was there anything that was more, logical or rational in terms of the investment opportunity, the market opportunity for this? Kind of coming at it from that lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was clearly a gap in the market around helping people understand what's going on in private companies. And in the early days, we sort of were kicking around this Bloomberg for private companies analogy, which some people tagged us with later. And we actually at one point had the former CEO of Bloomberg on our board. And I think there was something to that. I mean, there were some critical differences, which we then came to appreciate later through through trial and error. So, I mean, there was just this idea that like 99% of companies are private, but it was really hard to understand, you know, who they were, where they were, what they did, like, you know, what was going on inside the business. And so, you know, that as a calling, as a way, like reason to get out of bed every morning made a lot of sense. But the thing that, you know, I also said to my co-founder, which he claimed haunted him for many years after, was, you know, in some ways it felt like a solution in search of a problem. And I think, you know, when we got into the, you know, the nitty gritty of how do you actually execute the business strategy and, you know, build a sustainable, repeatable business, you know, that thing about, you know, not always being super focused on the problem that you were solving and who you were solving it for, you know, probably caused us, you know, a fair degree of heartache over the years at different points in time.
It's surprising to hear because obviously from the outside, like everything, it seems like such a success. How big did the company grow to in terms of revenue, team size? Yeah,
so I mean, this was the interesting thing, and I think, you know, fundamentally, like my background was always in enterprise, right? Was and am a B2B guy. My co-founder came more from a web design background. He was incredibly good on brand. He was incredibly good on sort of like hacking the psychology of the consumer and, you know, understanding their motivations. And so I think, you know, he probably naturally had a B2C bent, and the business he subsequently started was actually a B2C business. So, you know, our original, you know, model, if you like, for the business was a freemium model, and I don't think we actually even charged for anything for the first year or two we were in existence. So, you know, the business, you know, got a lot of, you know, had a lot of awareness quite quickly because, like you, we had loads of people who were free users of the product.
We weren't a free user, by the way.
Okay, you paid.
We definitely
Great.
paid.
I appreciate that. So, but you know, I'm sort of, you know, probably misremembering the actual stats, but it took us something like 12 to 18 months to get the first 25 or 30,000 users on the platform. But we then had this incredible period of growth, which was largely down to him and sort of his ability to, you know, hack into the mindset of the end user. And we grew that free registered user base from about 25,000 to 1.25 million in the next 18 months.
Wow.
So, you know, and it was a UK product. So when you think about the number of sort of white collar people in the UK who were using the product, it was a pretty good percentage of the market. And I still have people to this day like you who come up and they're like, oh, I used to use DueDil and when I was at this bank or that bank or did this or did that, which is really nice. But the thing that we figured out about freemium is, you know, freemium isn't free. Like, you know, it's you know, and I think of it much more as a marketing strategy than a business model, because, you know, for us to actually then acquire, convert, and serve those users profitably, it became incredibly challenging. You know, you get upside down on the unit economics very, very quickly, and you know, a lot of VCs will sort of tell you it's a lot about the unit economics, particularly now, right? And so that was, you know, we sort of tried different ways of making that work. And, you know, originally it was freemium and B2C, and then it became more B2B. And, you know, ultimately we kind of confronted this, you know, this decision about whether we make DueDil an true enterprise product, which is what I ultimately did when I took over as CEO.
So reconciling that with your last point around the risk of having a solution going in search of a problem, was that more a case of those early days, those first kind of 12, 18 months when you had that freemium model, or is it a case of when you did achieve that hockey stick growth, you feel it could have been bigger, just to kind of connect the dots with that opportunity there?
I think in some ways the rapid growth in users presented us with a real challenge because, you know, we weren't expecting to see it increase that quickly. And then when we started to kind of segment the user base, which is like the kind of natural thing to do, you're like, okay, well, who are these people? You know, what are they using it for? And we had a lot of different people using it for lots of different things. And so, you know, I always use this analogy of a chessboard, right? Like, you know, a lot of businesses, they're really clear from day one which square on the chessboard they're going to own. With DueDil in the early days, it was like we had pieces all over the chessboard, but obviously not all those squares are worth the same, and so for us the real puzzle became like, which of these use cases and which of these users is actually going to be the one that helps us build a scalable and sustainable business. And that sorting through process took a really long time and was actually a real challenge.
So 2-part question on your customer growth there. So 1, what was the catalyst for that hockey stick growth? And 2, what was then the segment that you focused on to go more
really
from chess to checkers?
Yeah. So I think the thing that really fueled the growth was, we always had really great UI in the product. That was a big reason why people came onto the product. The look and the feel was well ahead of its time. And again, that's full credit to my co-founder. He had a real feel for what a great whether it was consumer or enterprise, what a great experience in software should look like from a look and feel perspective. And so that brought a lot of people in. And that was, that kind of first impression and the word of mouth that was created off the back of that really helped. I mean, we did some things around, how we index pages and some geeky kind of search and SEO stuff. But I think the reason why people stuck around and continued to come back, it was the experience within the product. But, in terms of ultimately, who we chose to go for, that was a long running debate. We had a lot of heated debates about that because it wasn't obvious, and there were multiple potential answers to that question. I guess in the end, it was less decided by specific data or really seeing one particular segment take off, and more through a bit of trial and error and entrepreneurial instinct. And the segment that I was always very attracted to was serving larger financial services organizations. That was my background with my first role, and I felt like they should have more presence as users of DueDil than they did, or at least they seemed to be, as represented by the registered users. And so, but we hadn't ever really sold into a bank at that point as a business, right? We didn't have any big enterprise clients that we could point to and say, this is why we're going to pursue this strategy. And, it was just like getting out there and hitting the street and talking to people and seeing what stuck. And, that was ultimately what led us onto the path that we got onto, and that, FullCircl as a company is still on today.
Right. So this subject of who to focus on is, you said it's kind of a matter of a longer term sort of heated debate. Yeah. You also mentioned before you had some ups and downs with the co-founders and some disagreements. Yeah. Obviously, this is called strategy and tragedy for a reason. So can you share any of the other sort of low points, but I guess more from a co-founder perspective as to the sort of things that cropped up that was the most common, because I'm sure others will resonate. Yeah. And I guess crucially, how you then navigated that. Did you ever bring in kind of an external mediator or a coach or anything?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I'm really pleased to say that, we kind of got a good outcome in terms of, we caught it. We kind of recognized what was happening as it was happening. And so there was never any massive falling out. We're still on good terms. I mean, we don't hang out every weekend, but, we're still on good terms. And I, would love to, spend time with them again. So, and I hope the same is true. But, as we were sort of going through that period, it just became clear through the discussions that not just we were having, but we were having within the wider leadership team, that, people had different ideas about how we should ultimately execute the business. And by that point, we were under a bit of pressure because, we had raised our Series B, which at the time I think was the largest or one of the largest Series Bs in Europe. It certainly was for a pre-revenue business, which we were when we raised it. And, that money was starting to run out. We were starting to have to think about the next round, and you've become acutely aware of what you need to demonstrate between rounds in order to justify the next one. And so that whole cut and thrust of like, how are we gonna show what we need to show for the next investor or for the next round, came to the fore. And it just became, I guess, through that process of discussing, very clear that we had different ideas about the business and, ultimately wanted kind of different things for it. And that was difficult, right? Because we both were, not just us, but the team were very invested in the business and the mission. And, so I think the things in terms of how we got through that, the first thing that we did, which definitely made the biggest impact, was we brought in a chair. And we should have had a chair, I think, in the business much earlier than we did. It was somebody who ultimately we've kind of found out connected to one of our investors, but we didn't that wasn't the reason why they came in. They very much felt independent, which I think is important. And so, the chair was able to come in without the history, any of the baggage, any sort of particular financial incentive to drive it one way or the other, and just kind of meet us where we were. And, at the first, kind of time we had this discussion, I sort of put my hand up and I said, well, I'll leave. I've had a good run. My co-founder had actually seeded the business initially, so he had more money into the business at that point than I did, and I kind of felt like, okay, I've done what I need to do here, and I'll step back, and he can lead it forward in the way that he wants to. And, gradually through a variety of further discussions with the chair, with the board, with my co-founder, we kind of somehow the roles kind of got reversed. And, I ended up taking over the business as CEO. When we announced it to the team, that was a really emotional moment, as you would expect. And I think the format that we followed really stuck with me, because I think it was, not just helpful in terms of my co-founder and I finding a little bit of closure, but also helping the other people in the team feel okay about it, and also give them a point at which they could reflect on, okay, it's been this thing, now it's going to be something new. How do I feel about that? Do I want to go on that next leg of the journey or not, And the way we did it was, my co-founder stood up and sort of said his piece and, reflected on everything that we had done and all the things that, he was proud of, that we had accomplished together. And then our chair got up and he said some nice things about my co-founder, and then he said some nice things about me, and he said some, things about where the business was. And then I got up and I talked about the future. And, it was felt like a very natural, transition of, acknowledging, all of the success and the things that we had done together, kind of paying homage to that, but then actually, recognizing that, okay, we're now going to enter a new phase. And for those who want to be involved in that, kind of declare your hand now.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I was surprised to hear that, because in my mind, I was thinking these conversations were at the point you're already CEO, but then the twist in the story was that was actually beforehand.
Yeah.
So how did the roles reverse, especially with your co-founder having more skin in the game? How did you then become CEO?
So he decided that, he didn't want to lead the business anymore, and that it was time for him to step back.
And how many years had it been at that point?
It had been about 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
So, originally he was CEO, I was COO. We had quite shared responsibilities. We kind of were really working in tandem on the various aspects of the business. But through those conversations, he kind of, I think, reflected on what he wanted, and the investors obviously had input as well. And the chair was this sort of sounding board for each of us and for the group, and helping to kind of reconcile that for everybody. And ultimately, I kind of came to the decision, having agreed that I was going to be the one to step out. I felt like, I've got some unfinished business here, and I would really like to see if this strategy that I had in mind for the business could actually work.
Let's put it to the test.
Put it to the test, yeah.
What's interesting is when I first heard you speak was on a panel around the transition from founder to CEO, almost kind
Yeah.
of the different sort of style of leadership that you need when a company's going through different stages of growth. So
Yeah.
it makes even more sense
yeah.
that, you know, your story now, because it sounds almost as though, I don't know, you know, I haven't met your co-founder, but it sounds as though he's perhaps more of that kind of fire starter to get things going, up and running. And interesting, you saying, you know, about 5-6 years, that was the amount of time that I ran my last business.
Yeah.
And it's a good chunk of time. And, you know, it does kind of feel like, okay, it's kind of a chapter in a book. And then would you say that A, is that kind of a correct sort of interpretation of what happened? And then B, would you kind of put yourself very much in that sort of scale up CEO?
Yeah, I think
profile?
you know, if I had to pick, I think so. I mean, one of the things that always grated on me a little bit, and I don't know if he and I talked about this. I don't know if it grated on him, but it definitely grated on me. It was that, you know, I think the co-founder relationship is an interesting one, and people tend to get typecast a lot in that role, and I've really felt like I was getting typecast in some parts as this sort of, you know, logical COO, like, you know, and I didn't really like that, because I felt like, you know, there were times where I was and wanted to be, you know, sort of creative and, you know, the things that you typically associate with like the very early stage, you know, kind of caricature of a founder entrepreneur. And I think the way that I kind of got comfortable with that is like, you know, I kind of embrace, like, it was that thing about embracing the weirdness and embracing the things that, you know, other people maybe aren't that interested in. Like, founders and entrepreneurs come in like loads of different shapes and sizes. You know, they're not all Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. And I think
Thank goodness.
that tends to get overlooked, right? Like, there's a lot of different ways of building really interesting, impactful businesses that, you know, don't involve VC, for instance. And so, you know, I kind of got comfortable with like, look, I am who I am. My personality is my personality. I'm good at things I'm good at. But, you know, when I think about the phases of the journey that I enjoyed most, you know, there is that early excitement and the, you know, the kind of dynamism of like going in, you don't have product market fit yet, and you're trying to find product market fit. But, you know, I do feel like I've got more to give and am probably better in a situation where I can get some leverage on the business, right? Not financial leverage, but like operational leverage, right? There's like, you know, there is you know, I don't mind rolling up my sleeves, and I kind of will, you know, do whatever is required of me. But, you know, I really love that feeling of being in a high performing team where kind of like everybody knows why they're there and what you're there to accomplish. And, there's an ambiguity in that very early stage, which at some times is really fun, but other times, you know, can be a bit draining. And, you know, and I know other people, like, that's all they want to do when they, you know, start businesses. So, you know, I think it's like horses for courses, as my mother-in-law would say. But, you know, I'm definitely like more attracted to the idea of, you know, having a business that, you know, you can actually look to start to get some scale on.
Yeah, nice, exciting. I feel excited even just listening to you there. Quick one. I need to tell you a bit about Patreon. If you haven't heard of it before, Patreon is the creator platform that enables people like you to support podcasters like me. I actually studied art history for all of 5 minutes, which is where the whole idea of patronage, aka financially supporting artists, comes from. Kings and queens would commission artists to create paintings to adorn their castle walls. Upper class lords and ladies celebrated their accomplishments by using their wealth to support the arts. And during the Italian Renaissance, my favourite era, the Medicis actually developed a close bond with Michelangelo, who painted the Sistine Chapel, and the Sforza family supported Da Vinci, who helped name Leonardo DiCaprio. That is a true story, by the way. Anyway, I know that you're not here for a history lesson thrown in to your business studies class, but if you're feeling like a rich Renaissance royal who wants to support your very own little Botticelli here, then Patreon is the solution for you. Simply tap the link in the show notes to select your tier of patronage to support the show. It starts from a low amount, and it really means a lot to help me to continue producing these interviews that I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for listening. Let's get back into the episode. So we're going to kind of move along in the timeline, but before we do, and we close off, you know, what ended up happening with DueDil and everything else, you did hint at a few of the little hacks and tactics that work for you. What would you say were kind of the top 3 sales, marketing, activities, channels that helped grow your B2B SaaS company to the size that it did?
Yeah. So,
and if you can clarify exactly the size that it did.
Yeah. So we DueDil grew pretty quickly from a revenue perspective in the early days. But one of the things that became a real challenge was when we started focusing on enterprise, the growth slowed down. And the growth slowed down at a top line because we were kind of having to almost recycle the revenue. So we had to go from this like prosumer B2B revenue to actually then serving enterprise clients. Right. And so that was like a real challenge. I think we probably turned over like, 2/3 or 75% of the revenue stack in that transition from B2B to B2B.
Right. And was that a case of slow down to speed up situation?
A little bit, yeah. But there was also obviously like it was a difficult transition to manage because there were obviously like very different sales cycles involved in that. Yeah. And selling to a bank takes a lot longer than trying to flog a subscription to a small business or a bagel factory for that matter. Yeah, exactly. So, we kind of grew quite quickly to, 3 million of revenue, or 4 million of revenue. And then, we ultimately grew it to about 5.5, but within that 5.5, we probably like got to 5 and then went back to 3 and then had to like grow it again, which was a real challenge.
So I guess post pivot, if you like, with that, I like how you phrase the B to little b to B to big B.
Yeah.
What worked for you, I guess, kind of the top in both scenarios. So kind of the earlier days where it was more of that chess, a little bit of anything and everything. Yeah. And then what worked, if anyone's trying to crack that nut with like the Barclays, the JP Morgans, what worked for that other kind of bigger audience?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we, like all things, it was a combination of, being perceptive, but also a little bit of luck and being in the right place at the right time. And I think, one of the things that we did at DueDil from the very early days was we invested in the API. And, we had an API, a public API, and, what people told us was pretty good documentation well before that became, a standard in the industry. And so I think, that was something that we felt was different about the proposition that we could start to really major on. And so we obviously had some relationships in these institutions because we had some free users signed up. And so we started leveraging those relationships to basically knock down doors and start talking to senior people within banks about their challenges. And there was a huge challenge around, kind of 2016, 2017, where, people had, neobanks had kind of started to come on the scene. People were expecting more from their financial institution, but that was predominantly within the B2C space. And, we took a bet that it was only a matter of time before those expectations would be kind of carried over into the B2B space as well. And so, we were kind of stress testing that idea of like, okay, once you've digitized your consumer, retail channels, are you going to start thinking about your SME channels? And it was really, really clear that, there was a business imperative to do that, but also the market was changing in ways that meant that people had to do that. And so we were really early in the game in terms of, positioning our API as an enterprise grade product that people could then use to help power those digital onboarding journeys for their business customers.
And I guess that's where the luck comes in, right? With the market, what was going on there, the external factors.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that connectivity and the proximity to our end client and their objectives was, it's not anything new, but I can't stress it enough that like just having that, understanding of, the business drivers within their organization, their personal, motivations, their like, the whole thing, right? It's like, why should this person care about this? Yeah. Why do they care about it if they care about it, right? So just really getting under the skin of that was absolutely essential to us, being able to show some early wins, serving some very big, big institutions.
I love that. And just to underline that message for any listeners is, we are, when it's your own baby, it's hard to recognize that your product or service is really a small part of other people's day-to-day lives. So just echoing what you're saying there, like really understanding why does this matter to them, what's in it for them. So just to summarize some of what worked for you there is investing in the API, the strong product. You had a foot in the door with some of those early free users. I'm guessing you sort of use like direct sales, account-based marketing, like some of that direct approach to build those relationships, coupled with the understanding of, what do they really need? What do they care about? And then you sort of had the market movements with the neobanks. That was kind of the wind under your wings.
Yeah, I think, and the only other thing I would add to that, which I think worked really well for us and still works well for us today, is and it varies by industry, obviously, but financial services is a relationship-based industry at the end of the day, right? And so we started trying to provide content with people who are real practitioners in the industry, right? And not just get a big name on stage to talk about how they conquered the world, but getting into the kind of nitty-gritty of like, well, how do you run a big transformation program in an incumbent financial institution, right? And so we had we would do some webinars and some blogs, but we had our own sort of podcast webinar series that we posted for a little while, where we were talking about talking with people who were embedded in the industry and confronting these challenges, and then the thing that we still do today, which everybody loves, is we a couple times every quarter we get people together at the Ivy and give them a nice lunch and give them an opportunity to hear from somebody interesting in their industry who understands what they're going through, and for them to network with their peers. And actually the return on that is phenomenal.
But it takes time, to your previous point of how you had those dips, the peaks and troughs.
Yeah, and I think particularly selling into financial services, like a lot of fintech and regtech companies struggle with that sale because maybe they're doing it for the first time. Even if you've done it before, like I had, it still takes a long time. But I think there is a degree of and I hope this is changing, but there is a degree within financial services of, well, let's wait and see, right? And so there's a real challenge, I think, from a funding perspective in terms of the capital and patience required to prove product market fit, trying to execute an enterprise sale into, a big bank or a big insurer, because, you go out and you raise 12 to 18 months of runway, and
that's just one sales life cycle.
That's a sales cycle, right?
Exactly.
And so, it's really, really difficult to sort of break in, and, the people in the financial institution generally, will say, well, let's wait a couple of years and see if these people are still around, and then maybe we'll sort of be willing to take a chance on them. And I think, one of the things that probably really benefited us in helping us break in a little bit quicker was that, DueDil did have that brand awareness and name recognition, having been in the market for so long. And so, even though we were kind of making this pivot and serving a different end user in a different way, we were kind of a known quantity, and that full credit for that goes to my co-founder, because we never would have had the kind of notoriety that we had as a brand if it wasn't for him.
I'm so happy that you say that, because someone from the branding and marketing world, it's a drum that I feel like I have to beat all the time, and it's such a uphill slog, especially these days when VC funding has dried up and budgets are tight. It's always, it's the first thing to go, but it's great to hear, from the horse's mouth, so to speak, that actually there are cases where it did help us, categorically, it set us up for success. It just, but
it's a slow burn, right?
Right. But it is definitely a personal bugbear of mine when it's like, it just feels like a constant argument you have to make. So it's great, for people to hear that coming from you. And I was also just going to say, I definitely got my taste of these long sales cycles, going to these bigger companies with my last business. I remember being in some sales calls, and if we lost out on a pitch or situation changed, I remember sometimes feedback would be like, but love what you do, definitely great fit. Like, let's stay in touch. We'll circle back in 6-9 months time. And the first thought that crosses my mind is, I don't know if my business is going to be alive in 6 months time. Yeah. But of course, when you're dealing with people who are employed at these large organizations, that thought, of course, doesn't even cross their mind, right? They're in this secure, cushy job, and they're just kind of like, whatever, we'll let them. They'll still get their pay slips.
Unless you get kicked over to the procurement team, then sometimes they're on you. But I would agree.
It's funny, isn't it? Just a completely different mind. You're like, you have no idea even if my business is still going to be here. But fine, I'll try and stay alive until then. So no, I love that you make those excellent points. All right, so moving along in the timeline, because I'd love to get onto Outpost Advisors and definitely plug, what you're doing at the moment and a few other things I want to chat to you about very quickly. So just to wrap up kind of the DueDil chapter, which I know has now become FullCircl.
Yeah.
So how are things left? I genuinely have no idea how that story ended.
Yeah, so, we kind of set off on this new strategy in 2018, started selling into financial institutions. It was going reasonably well. We signed up a number of really well-known, banks, fintechs, insurers, most of whom we still work with today. And, so that part of it was successful. What we didn't count on was COVID happening. And that sort of, we had a cash to break even plan that got a big hole blown in it. And, it was the kind of beginning part of COVID where everything was still scary and, we didn't sort of have the subsequent boost in the funding environment that we saw in the back of kind of 2022. So, and by that point, DueDil had been through a few different incarnations, right? We had lots of investors, some of whom had been in for a long time, a very complicated cap table. And, so we just had this sort of come to Jesus talk as a board. And I said, look, I think we've got three options here. We can either, try and sell to a trade buyer. We can try and get a new investor in, or we can do something else. And we pursued all three options. We had options on all three. But it was ultimately the something else that was most interesting to me and the team and to our investors, because it was the thing that, allowed us to continue to pursue the opportunity that we knew was there, but it kind of gave us a bit of a fresh start. And so we merged with a company called Artesian Solutions in 2021. That was an interesting one because we had known Artesian for a while, and at different points we had competed with them. But the businesses had sort of gone off in slightly different directions. The thing that we, however, both doubled down on was selling into financial services. And so the products evolved in these different ways. We were both selling into financial services, but we were doing slightly different things for them. And so when I spoke to Andrew, who became my co-founder at FullCircl, it became obvious that there were some things about the two businesses that were highly complementary. And we put the businesses together. It allowed the majority of our investors and their investors to kind of maintain a stake in the future upside of the business, but allowed us, at least on the DueDil side, to deal with a lot of the legacy and the baggage that was kind of dragging us down in certain respects. So I stayed on to lead the integration of those two businesses. We rebranded to FullCircl because DueDil Artesian was a bit of a shit name. Didn't the hyphenated double barrel name for the company wasn't really working. We were sort of off to the races. I think that experience was valuable because it kind of it was hugely interesting for me from a personal perspective, because it was an opportunity. I'd done a lot of funding rounds, but I'd never done M&A before, and so that was a really interesting experience. The integration was really interesting, but it also then sort of gave us a bit of confidence, I guess, that this could actually be part of our strategy going forward. And I think we were sort of seeing some signs in the wider funding market that, businesses that had raised, a long time ago on inflated valuations were going to have a reckoning at some point. And, not everybody was going to make a clean jump from 2 to 10 million and be able to go on to growth equity and, those sorts of things. And so, that kind of proved to be the case. We started seeing a lot of businesses that were fundamentally really solid businesses, but, they hadn't, like, Artesian and DueDil hadn't quite gotten to where they needed to get to attract a private equity backer or, be a really obvious acquisition for a big trade buyer or something like that. And so, we ultimately, the last thing I did before leaving FullCircl at the end of last year was we acquired and integrated another business.
Wow.
Called W2, which is part of FullCircl.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, imagine the double barreling thing if you'd gone if you'd done
exactly.
a triple barrel.
Triple barreled, exactly.
DueDil, Lucy and W2.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
the benefits on the naming side of things, which is
Yeah.
interesting. And so I presume kind of ultimately you decided, okay, this is going on another trajectory now. It's time for me to move on and do something else.
Yeah, look, I mean, I am still super proud of what we built at DueDil and FullCircl. I'm in touch with a lot of ex-DueDilers, and they've gone on to amazing places, and they all say, DueDil was such a significant part of my my early career, and kind of you have that thing like with your it might not necessarily be your first job, but it's like your first true love kind of thing, right? It's like the place that you really started to understand something about yourself, and you became you felt like you kind of became an adult there in certain respects.
Mm-hmm.
And I think DueDil was really fun because we had a group of people who I think shared that experience. FullCircl is now in a different phase. It's a profitable scale business, but we were able to sort of create some of that that culture and environment that I certainly loved at DueDil. The thirst for learning and improving, and really investing in people. FullCircl retained a lot of that, but for me personally, it had been, an 11+ year journey.
Wow.
With different twists and turns,
right?
Different roles, different strategies. And I got to the point where, I felt like I wanted to, feel that fire again.
Yeah.
And learning something new and being a beginner, and learning a different, maybe a different industry or a, different type of business. And so I had a discussion with my co-founders at FullCircl and agreed that W2 being integrated into the FullCircl family was kind of a nice point at which I could feel good about what we had done and step off the bus to create space for what comes next.
Right, a nice segue into what's next. So what's the
Yeah.
elevator pitch for Outpost Advisors?
Well, you're catching me about 6 weeks into it, so I'm still forming the
You can
elevator pitch.
practice
Still
it on
forming
me
the
and
elevator
my
pitch.
listeners.
But yeah, I mean, I guess first of all, the name. So like Outpost Advisors, I can't quite articulate why, but it really resonates with me. I think it comes back to that sense of not being afraid to like put yourself out there on the frontier. And the frontier has been a through line in my career. I went to the APAC region when I was 23 and moved around Hong Kong, Tokyo, Singapore, setting up offices. So I very much felt like I was on the frontier there. I came to the UK not expecting to stay. I've been here for 15 years now, kind of, on the frontier of starting things like Innovate Finance and helping co-found DueDil and all of these, adventures that I've had. So, that spirit of adventure and not being afraid to, be on the frontier, be a bit self-reliant, really resonated quite strongly with me. Mm-hmm. And so, with Outpost, the thing that I'm spending a lot of time on, I have a few clients and they range from, kind of startups to scale ups, sort of starting to tip into private equity backed businesses. One of the things that I experienced at DueDil and FullCircl was that, when sales aren't going well and, that conversation inevitably comes up at the board, the investor's first instinct is often to kind of look at sales execution, right? It's like, oh, the sales team sucks. We need better salespeople, or, we need some sales training, or we need to hire a VP of sales or a CRO or whatever. And, no disrespect to anybody in the, kind of revenue functions within businesses, because it's obviously, the engine room for a lot of companies. You're never going to regret tightening up your sales execution. But I think the question that isn't asked frequently enough is, why is the product hard to sell in the first place, right? And, if your strategy as a business relies on hiring, A++ salespeople, it's not a very scalable or likely to be a successful strategy, right? Like, the business I want to build is, finding salespeople who have the right values and attitude, and, maybe they're only average salespeople, right? But you're kind of putting them in this environment and you're enabling them with the proposition in such a way that they can smash it, And so this idea of proposition refinement has been something that's come, kind of continue to come back, and I'm now seeing in a lot of the work that I'm doing with my clients, where it's like trying to get the lens of, how the business positions itself in the market, like, whether it's talking about itself through marketing or through the sales team, how the product delivers on that promise, and then how you enable the client to get to success. It's like getting those three lenses into focus. And I think because I've always had one foot in the commercial function and one foot in the product side of the business, like that, kind of doing that, toggling is, really natural for me. And so, I like kind of being able to go into a business and say, okay, well, this is how you talk about yourself. This is how your competitors talk about themselves. This is what your product actually does. And it's not doing some of the things that you say it does, or it's not doing them very well, or you're not investing in the roadmap in those areas, or, your enablement team isn't actually getting people to value to, show the client that, remind them that's why they bought you. So, I think that's a really interesting area and a rich seam to kind of continue to explore.
I love that. That definitely speaks to my heart, again, with more of the marketing background. My last business was a marketing consultancy, and you can imagine the amount of times that a client would come to me and my team and expect us to come in and wave a magic wand and suddenly like make us famous, bring in a load of sales, and you're like, we don't have product market fit yet. Like, how have you haven't validated the demand, you haven't validated the intensity of the problem, but you kind of, you go to these people and and lower, and then it kind of, it compounds when it doesn't work. And as you say, the response from the board is then like, you default to these automatic solutions. Yeah. And if you've held any prior beliefs, especially again, the dark arts of marketing or the fluffiness of brand, it's like, see, told you it didn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think even if you have a degree of product market fit, you kind of notice these points of friction within the sales cycle or within the, the path to value for the, like one of the things that I've really internalized, I guess, particularly with a lot of our financial services clients, is like time to value, right? It's like, okay, like you've won the sale. Like, how do you enable the client so that you reduce time to value as much as possible, so that they're reminded about why they bought you, because like if you can't do that, then renewal is going to be a really difficult conversation. So I think even businesses that are really successful, you can like over time, things just drift, right? Like the product roadmap starts drifting in a different direction. You get a new thread to the story, which, maybe it's through an acquisition or a new product launch or whatever. And, then you sort of stand back objectively and you go, actually, this isn't really as coherent as it used to be, you know? And so I think just doing those MOTs every once in a while where you sort of look to make sure that, the messaging, the product, and the delivery are all kind of like in alignment. It's a really healthy habit to be in. Yeah,
I love that. I totally get it. Justin, I could talk to you for hours and hours, but these interviews, they always go by far too quickly. So I'm going to have to speed through the rest of my questions. So I'm only going to ask you a couple more. Penultimate question is, what has, I guess, sort of zooming back out across your various positions and, where you are now, is what do you think has set you up for the greatest chance of success in terms of both kind of practically on a day-to-day, like how do you sort of take care of yourself or self-develop, and then kind of on a wider scale, kind of societally, what are some of the privileges that you recognize that have helped you get to where you are now? Just kind of what have been more of the wins under your wing that have helped you get?
That's a big question.
Yeah, sorry. So, I mean, I'm squeezing that in at the end there.
All right. Yeah, just drop that one at the end.
Exactly.
No, look, I think, I have been, I'm a massive supporter of education as a, kind of instrument for economic mobility and social mobility. I'm a walking case in point. I was very lucky when I was 14 to get a scholarship to a school that my parents never could afford. The tuition was more than my parents made, right? Wow. So, that was really the thing that sort of put me on a trajectory which allowed me to then go and access other opportunities, educationally or otherwise, that just blew my world wide open, right? So I think, having somebody or some buddies who took a chance on me as a 13-year-old to get me into that environment and support me there, made all the difference. So, that would be the thing from a sort of personal history perspective. I think more recently, I spend a lot of time reflecting and refining my personal routine, and I think, there's a great saying, discipline equals freedom. And, it's not that you need to be robotic about it, but I think, I'm somebody who gets a real kick out of variety, right? So I think it's a constant juggling act of kind of having some things that you can really rely on, but, you still keep some room for spontaneity and variety in your life. But, for me, those are things like, not putting my health and physical activity down the priority list. I would always, like a lot of people, I'd always find a reason before something more urgent, more important, quote unquote, would come in, and I would, be like, oh, well, I'll go to the gym tomorrow. I'll go for a run tomorrow. I'll go for a swim tomorrow, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's a big one. Meditation and mindfulness. I know it's cliche, but I've been doing it for probably 10, 12 years now. Helped me through a real difficult life transition in my late 20s. And, part of that, I guess an extension of that is journaling, writing, using the discipline of the page to, help make your thoughts as coherent as they can be and stress test them. And so, that sort of ability and willingness to kind of go back and revisit, how do I take notes? What's my day look like in terms of the things that are going to renew and sustain me? All of those sorts of things I think are really important if you want to, continue to perform at a high level.
Amazing. I love that so much. I've got so many comments on what you said. I think on the, how you take notes, what you just said there, you made me think. I keep a load of old notebooks and journals, and I've never really thought about it so much, but even the way that I've written things before, I know that was stressful. If my writing is all over the place and scrawly and in every single corner, and then I've actually noticed now my writing is much more, it's actually on the lines, you can read it properly. So funny. And I think also just to comment on, someone taking a bet on you has been a recurring theme. Someone told me recently about, I think it's the story of Steven Spielberg and how he was on a tour of a film set, just visiting, and when he was a teenager, and he purposely held back and hid in the bathroom, and he didn't go back with the rest of them, and he used that opportunity to mingle with the people and talk to the other directors and stuff, and it was someone there who recognized. So I think there's such a life lesson there of you do need to put yourself in those situations.
Totally.
I presume, the scholarship you were awarded was obviously off the back of your hard work, your merit, but it has to be both. Someone still has to take that chance on you and recognize that. 100%. Same's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to tons of listeners as well. Yeah. But they seem to be these one-off instances, this single person,
just changes your trajectory in life. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, something that I've, tried to remember in terms of, paying it forward and trying to be as generous as I can be with my time or, support other people in that way, because I was a massive beneficiary of that, and we wouldn't be having this conversation if that hadn't happened.
Yeah,
so
amazing. All right, very sadly, final question. Yes. Tradition on this show, which is strategy and tragedy, has been created with one of the core beliefs that sometimes the best lessons can come from the biggest mistakes or tragedies, if you will. I know that you've alluded to a few so far, but is there one that we haven't already covered that's a big tragedy, so to speak, in your career that's taught you an unforgettable lesson?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that the period after we merged DueDil with Artesian was a funny one, because I wouldn't call it a tragedy by any means, because it was a great outcome, but there was, for me personally, And I'm sure, maybe the same was true with my co-founder when he handed over the reins to me, that, there's this sort of feeling of like this almost like mini grief process that you go through, because, even if you've gotten a good outcome, it might not have been the outcome that you thought you were going to get when you started. And, so like the merger with Artesian and the creation of FullCircl is one of my real career highlights. It was like, it was interesting. It was the right decision. It's created a business today that employs, 100 people, and it's, thousands of clients and end users. And, so it's great. But, for me after that period, it was just like, okay, actually, this isn't quite how I thought it would go, and how do I feel about that? And what does that mean about me? And what does that mean about what I want to do next? And so I think just, and I've had a similar experience actually stepping back from FullCircl and starting this next adventure. That transition period, I think it's really important to be willing to like reflect and embrace the ambiguity that you find yourself in. And but it's not comfortable at all. And I probably don't do it very well, if I'm being honest.
I don't think anyone does. I think it's in human nature to seek out that certainty, and especially in business when it's yours, co-founder, CEO, there's so much of your own identity that's wrapped up in that. So when that goes, it almost feels like I totally get kind of the head and the heart kind of conflicting there, because I think it sort of sounds like logically this was a great deal, this all made sense, but in your heart it's kind of, I feel like the rug's sort of been pulled out from under me, and where am I at now? Justin, thank you so much for your time. I could definitely keep going with the questions. I'm gonna have to leave it there.
Really nice chatting with you. Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for listening. I really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. Please rate, review the show, subscribe. It really helps us out. Stick around. The episodes are weekly, and hope you enjoy the next one. Thanks a lot.